This is a project not just with Ola, but with a whole bunch of people at different universities, with labs at the University of Pennsylvania, at Manchester, with Ola, at University of Maryland, and at the Kiev School of Economics, and with my team at the University of North Carolina. And this was born out of a feeling that was mentioned yesterday of powerlessness and shock back in February, and then a desire to find some way of doing something constructive with the skills that social scientists have in the context of Russia's all-out invasion. And so our thought was, is there a way that we can use social media data, which many of us on the team have worked with for some time, in order to provide sort of near real-time information on human rights abuses and on humanitarian needs and things like that, that could actually be of some constructive use to authorities and emergency response and those kinds of things. And so what we came up with is essentially an effort to sort of create a near real-time reporting system for different kinds of events related to the war that would require a public response. To do that, there are basically 5 tasks that we had to complete. One is to actually work out how to build a sustainable system for collecting and storing real-time data, and as you'll see in a second, it gets very large very quickly. And then the second task is, out of all of that data, how to identify what's relevant and important and usable. And then the third task is to location, right? Is to actually put this somewhere so that people could, in a reliable way, respond and know what was going on, not just what, but where. Then the next task is okay, now we have all this mountains of stuff, how are we going to present it and analyze it in a way that's sort of interesting and understandable and useful. And then finally, how to get all of that data in front of the people who can actually do something with it, as opposed to just working on it from their office. So the first task, I'm not going to say much about this, in part because I only know what some of these terms mean. But the first task was essentially to decide on a platform, and many people on the team had worked on Twitter before, and we can talk about the pluses and minuses of that in the Ukrainian context. But we decided to collect Twitter data. We had a very kind of rough filter to identify tweets that were at least potentially on the topics that we were interested in. At the start of the conflict, we were collecting 5 million tweets a day. We're down now to a mere 2 million or so a day, so it gets big really fast. So the big task is to work out how to identify useful information amongst that. And there's basically 2 elements to that task. One is to identify relevant communities. And to do this, we started off, Ola led a team collecting 400 sort of core Twitter handles amongst people in the media and in kind of responsible positions in the regions around Ukraine. We then connected that up with the broader community of people who tweet and retweet them, and we've been collecting this over time. It's a mixture of Ukrainian, English, and Russian. The mix varies from time to time. And those different languages, as I'll explain in a second, are pretty significant for the kinds of information you can gather. The second task was how to categorize all of this stuff, and so this is where we started thinking about what kinds of events we were interested in, and we came up with 4 basic categories: human rights abuses, civilian resistance, displaced people, and humanitarian needs. And then we have to do the enormous, and as many of you know from Twitter, is a very dynamic space. So an enormous and evolving task of working out keywords that we could use in order to reliably identify those things. And so we now have somewhere in the region of 1,800 keywords that we use to classify events. Then we had to geolocate. To geolocate things on Twitter, many of you know the metadata on Twitter, on tweets, is pretty useless. It's especially useless in the context of mass displacement. So we created basically a list of town and location names in Ukraine in the 3 languages that we use with multiple different spellings, and we take the search, the text of the tweets themselves to geolocate them. The next task, so we've now created all of this data, masses and masses of data. Is it garbage? And so the first task is to sit down and old school actually read through a lot of this stuff. And so Ola and I and our teams have spent a lot of time reading through essentially the most tweeted tweets in each of the categories and trying to work out, do they actually refer to what we hope they refer to? And the short answer is more or less they do, actually. It's pretty, to me, it was a little surprising how reliable this was. And then what's really cool too is that we often get evidence of events happening in the Twitter data often 3 to 5 hours before major events start appearing in the media. And so this is actually a kind of early warning system in some sense. The data are all presented on dataforukraine.com. I'll show you some of just a quick insight into some of the ways that we present it there. One of the ways is to present patterns of data over time. So this is a screenshot from last night of the last couple of days on the human rights abuses discussion on Twitter, and what you see is it's been very active, up to about nearly 0.5% of all tweets that we collected in the last 24 hours have actually been about human rights abuses, which is a pretty high number, actually. You can also locate these tweets in space and time. This is a very cool tool that allows you to basically take your date range and set it, and then also pick your favorite kind of event and then map it separately, or you can map them all together on a map of Ukraine that you can then zoom into and identify pretty well the specific locations. So I encourage you to check this out. Just in the couple of minutes that I have left, some sort of things that we've learned while doing this. One is that language matters, and different languages produce different kinds of information. So if you're really interested in the breaking news about what's really going on, then Ukrainian is the best source for those kinds of events. Russian is obviously pretty good for events in parts of the East, whereas the English language tweets are more about Western responses or about retweeting previous events. In the paper, there's also a sort of a human rights mini case study in which we discuss the granularity of the data. So we have this big data thing with all of these graphs of hundreds of thousands of tweets, but we also have the tweets. So you can really dig into this and you can identify very specific information on well-known events, but also on individual cases in other places. Reading this, we sort of find that there are 3 main types of human rights abuses that can be thought of as attacks on civilians and property, attacks on the body, crimes against the body of kidnapping and torture and those kinds of things. And then the third type is the use of weapons that are otherwise forbidden. We also find some interesting things on deoccupations. What we find is that some of the tweeting about human rights abuses often precedes the news of deoccupation. So there's a kind of a lag going on there, which is really interesting. So just to wrap up, we had initially started this thinking this would be really good for agencies working on surges of refugees or on steering humanitarian relief. I don't quite, to be honest, we can talk about this, but we don't have a strong sense of the extent to which it's being used, and we're very much in the task of getting this to the people who could actually use it in an actionable way is one that we're still trying to work through. But for things like the ICC investigations, these tweets are not presentable in court, but they provide lots and lots of leads for potential investigators. And then for researchers, I'll just mention one study. I have a student at the University of North Carolina who's working on sexual violence as a tool of war. She has a qualitative data set of 65 cases. We have many, many, many more in this data set, and so she's in the process now of adding to her qualitative data set through the tweets that we found, and then also using the broader Twitter data to contextualize what she's found in the qualitative research. And that's just one example of what I hope are dozens and dozens of things that people could use this data for. Thank you.